Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Comic-Con at Home panel. This is the Legacy of Aztec Culture, 500 Years After the Fall. This year, 2021, marks the official, what's sometimes considered the official end of the Aztec Empire, which fell to Spanish invaders after a prolonged conflict. But contrary to what a lot of people think, Aztec culture, or what we call Aztec culture, still exists, and it has a huge impact on the world we live in, including the pop culture world. We're excited to welcome all these wonderful panelists today who are all creators who are making Mesoamerican or Aztec themed projects in comics, video games, animation, prose, and other media. We really have an amazing spread of talent here. So I'm very excited to welcome our panelists. We have with us today Sophia Alexander. She is the creator and executive producer of the animated series Onyx, Equinox, which is airing on Crunchyroll. And she's also a voice actor on the show, multi-talented, like all our panelists. Sophia also designed the characters in Onyx, Equinox. And she has done storyboards on shows such as Infinity Train, Invader Zim, Stretch Armstrong, and The Powerpuff Girls, one of my personal favorites in both incarnations. Sophia was the recipient of the New Voice of the Year Award in Animation from Animation Magazine's 2020 Hall of Fame Awards. I think almost everyone here has won awards, all well-deserved. We also have with us today David Bowles. Wave, hi, David. David is a Mexican-American author and translator who's written several, yes, award-winning titles, notably The Smoking Mirror and They Call Me Guerrero. In 2019, he co-founded the hashtag and activist movement Dignidad Literaria, which has negotiated greater Latinx representation in publishing and continues to work on that front. David has also worked on several TV and film projects, including Victor and Valentino on the Cartoon Network. I understand we have some fun stuff to look forward to there. The Moctezuma and Cortez miniseries that was in production from Amblin Entertainment, and Monsters and Mysteries in America from Discovery. Always prolific, David has several projects in the works, including his upcoming graphic novel, Clockwork Curandera, which we'll get a look at shortly, and new volumes in his space opera prose series, The Path. Also with us today is Henry Barajas. There you are. Henry's been writing, lettering, and editing and publishing comics for at least 10 years. He is best known for his graphic memoir about his great-grandfather, Ramon Huarigue, which is titled La Voz de Mayo Tatarambo. He has a new series, Helm Great Castle, which we'll be looking at shortly, that's coming out from Image and Top Cow Comics. We also have Guillermo Vizcaino, who is a writer, producer, and head of marketing with Lienzo, a video game development company studio located in Chihuahua, Mexico. Guillermo helped create Mulaka, a video game based on the Tarahumara indigenous tribe in northern Mexico, which was done with the tribe's involvement. Very interesting project. And the studio's latest project goes in a different direction. It's Aztec Forgotten Gods, a futuristic game that's being released in fall 2021. We will also get a good look at that. And finally, we have Paul Kynan, who is my husband and collaborator. Paul is a multimedia artist and writer who's been creating comic books and other visual narratives for more than 30 years. I narked you on your age, kind of. He is a founding member of Helioscope Studio, which is the largest collective of comic book creators in North America. And Paul and I have collaborated on many projects, including our science fiction comic book series, Heartbreakers, 2 illustrated historical fiction books called Boilerplate and Frank Reed, and Paul's current epic graphic novel series, Aztec Empire. And my name is Anina Bennett. I'm a writer, an educator, and a recovering comic book editor with credits at Dark Horse Comics, Image Comics, and First Comics, among others. Okay, Sophia, can you tell us a little bit about Onyx Equinox and what the story and characters are about, and how you incorporate Mesoamerican elements of culture in this animated series?
Yeah, of course. So Onyx Equinox is an animated show heavily inspired by the anime style, which is a Japanese animation style. And the story is about Izel, who is an Aztec boy who is saved by the gods in order to be forced to act as humanity's champion in order to save humanity from being destroyed and remade for the 5th time.
There have been monsters for as long as we can remember.
We've remade humanity 4 times before.
Izel, be brave. The gods have to pick someone else.
Come on, adventure awaits.
There was never going to be enough blood for all of us.
So, let's make a bet of it.
And the stakes?
Our lives.
I have a destiny to ensure you do yours.
I've got a terrible idea.
Wow, that is a really dramatic trailer. And I love that you're using the, sourcing all this as this Mesoamerican mythology and really bringing those characters to life, as well as some of the actual settings that people would have lived in.
So yeah, and here we have the platform is the god Chak, or for Maya, and for the Nahua people, this is Tlaloc. And he was usually depicted with a trunk, much like an elephant, which is very interesting because they did not have elephants back in Mesoamerican time.
So this is like a ceremonial site and very grand architecture, and it's amazing to see this kind of thing depicted, as you said, as it would have been instead of as ruins. Even using that in a fantasy setting is really cool. And I like that you also have some everyday settings.
So that was fun to depict, as well as like the more normal part of like being human in Mesoamerica, because we're so used to seeing them as like bloodthirsty and like ill depicted by Hollywood, because shock, the shock factor of it is what sells.
Yeah, I like that even in a fantasy series where you're not necessarily trying to be historically accurate, you've incorporated both this sort of like very like larger than life mythology and the characters out of that, as well as these everyday aspects of life and how people would have actually gone to the market. And yes, there were artisans and farmers and selling and making all kinds of things. It was a pretty sophisticated culture, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we will dive into some of these influences a little bit more after we introduce the other projects. David, you're up. What can you tell us about the 80 books that you have coming up this year?
Yeah, no, I mean, most of my work, and I mean, you joke, but I do have 25 books out. So most of my work, I would say probably about 70% of it draws from Mesoamerican sacred stories and culture and so forth to some degree or another. And I mean, sometimes it's like this outright, like in my book Feathered Serpent, Dark Hearted Sky, which is the retranslations and retellings of sacred stories and legends and so forth from Mesoamerica. And then the graphic novel series that's coming out adapting some of those called Tales of the Feathered Serpent. But most of the time, I prefer to write speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror, whatever. And there, what I do is I draw elements from the Aztec lore and Mesoamerican sacred stories or whatever to craft news stories set in the future or set in the present or in alternate pasts that play with these ideas and use them respectfully to tell stories that perhaps I couldn't tell otherwise. The project that I'm working on right now, though, that's coming out in October, is the Clockwork Curandera series. The first volume is The Witch Owl Parliament, and it's set in an alternate 1865 in northern Mexico and southern Texas that are called the Republic of Santander. If you'll switch to the next slide, there's like a map of it. You can see that it's most of Tamaulipas, a big chunk of some of the neighboring states, the big chunk of Nuevo León, and the capital is Laredo. And I mean, frankly, back under New Spain, this area that it was called Nuevo Santander, Santander being a city in Spain. And so this is just imagining a world where indigenous magic and steampunk technology coexist. And you'll see in some of these panels, the brother of the main character's name is Cristina Franco Pedregon, and her brother is Enrique. And Enrique he's gone off to study alchemy, and he uses alchemy to bring her back to life after she's attacked by lechuzas, which are witches that transform into owls. And witches that transform into owls are, and a lot of people in Mexico and Mexican Americans in the US know these stories, and you grow up being scared of the possibility that the owls outside of your house are actually witches keeping an eye on you. But what a lot of us don't know is that belief in those kinds of witches is deeply rooted in Nahuatl tradition, Aztec tradition. The kind of magic that could help a witch transform into an owl is called chichotl, and they were called chitzli. This is an Nahuatl word for witch. And so we see him using spells in Nahuatl, in the language of the Nahuas of the Aztecs, to bring her back to life. And the next slide shows you a little bit more about how she was trained as she's an apprentice curandera, an apprentice shaman or healer. And when she was growing up, when she was studying to be a curandera, her teachers would tell stories of the time when the owl tribe allied with the Aztecs and kind of took over the area that's now the Republic of Santander, and how they subjugated other indigenous groups and so forth. And now they were finally expelled, and now they've come back. And that's part of this. The first volume is they're trying to figure out why they are attacking the people of Santander, why they left her for dead, and so forth. You can go to the next slide.
I love that there's a specific kind of magic for turning yourself into an owl.
Yeah, because in general, that kind of magic, the people that do that kind of magic are what we nowadays call nahuales, but that were called nahualtin in Nahuatl. But that's the specific subgroup of nahualtin that transformed into owls were the chitzli. So it is cool that there's a specific word for that. So it's a lot of fun, and it's drawn by Raul III, Raul Gonzalez, who's an incredible artist.
Wow, I'm excited about this. I love his artwork, and he's really, if you know what you're looking at with comic book storytelling, he does some really, really interesting stuff. Henry, can you talk to us a little bit about your series that's coming out right now, Helm Greycastle?
I'm so honored to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm Henry Barajas. You might know me from La Voz de Mayo. La Voz de Mayo is highlighted as one of the top 20 adult graphic novels from the Graphic Novel Roundtable American Library Association that was done with Jay Gonzo. And the reason why I introduced La Voz de Mayo is because while I was working on this history about my great-grandfather who helped one of the last Native American tribes, the Pascoyaki, gain federal recognition in the United States during the Carter administration, that's where I found out that the Oeme tribe that my family is indigenous and a part of, they were documented during the Spanish Inquisition. And learning about that about myself was kind of well, it was great, but it was also alarming that I'm 30 years old and I didn't know much about Mesoamerican history. And at that around that time, I started to learn about D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, and I started playing, and I loved it, and then I was like, where is there any brown people in this? There isn't any. And then I started to look inward, and I was realizing that my fantasy books that I love, like Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, there was no brown people in it. So I wanted to figure out a way to bring them in. So Helm Greycastle, my elevator pitch is, what if Mordor had a south side? What if there was a part of this very Euro white space that they didn't know that there was all these brown people below them that influenced some things? And Helm is tasked with him and his comrades to go and save a dragon blood prince, and they wander into this Mesoamerican world that is fictionalized. The idea is, what if the Aztecs were able to beat the Spanish using magic? And it draws from historical events. One of my biggest influences was Broken Spears, which I think it's called The Broken Spears, the Aztec account of the conquest of Mexico, which is the indigenous side. And I think I got that from Paul in his like required readings in his Patreon, which I hope everybody goes and throws money at the man, because it helped me realize, oh yeah, all the Aztec knowledge that I do know is from white educators. And I'm sorry, white people, but I'm going to throw you under the bus, but you have really claimed the space. And I wanted to incorporate some of this information in a fantasy setting. And that's why it's called Helm Greycastle. It is a bait and switch. Like La Voz de Mayo Tata Rambo is a mouthful. It is hard for people to say. They don't know whether to say mayo, if there's chunks in it, or there's olive oil in it. But no, it's Mayo, Mexican American, Yaqui, and others. So when I tell people about Helm Greycastle, it's like giving your pet medicine. You're giving them like a beefy treat, but inside there's like a kernel of knowledge that's going to help you realize that Mesoamerican history is North American history. So what I love about the cover that David Lapham drew with my co-creator Brian Valenza is there is this clash. There's fantasy and Mesoamerican Jaguar Knights crashing into each other, and it's going to be bloody. It's going to be fun, and what I love about a lot of this Mesoamerican history is that a lot of the information is kind of already done for me. With La Voz de Mayo, I had to go in from the ground up and learn about my family's history. So when I was thinking about this story, it was like, how do I blend fantasy with brown people, and how do I make it easy enough to where it's not that jarring? I mean, it kind of says it for itself. There's Jaguar Knights. There was eagle, eagle fighters. There was deities and gods and sacrifice, but also wanted to talk about their accomplishments in cuisine and the astrology, how they looked at the stars, how they created the calendar. And the only reference I have for something like this is it's D&D meets Apocalypto, which was made by a known racist, Mel Gibson. And it's kind of hard to so that's why Helm Greycastle is something that I needed to tell after La Voz de Mayo. And there's a Stepan Sejic cover, who is one of the best Witchblade artists, and that was like the Feathered Temple reference. Wanted to include more history, more of the art and typography, and have like this be something that people like us on this panel, that this comic is made for 4 people actually. So really, it's really made for you. And if goblins and wizards and Goliaths can exist, Mexicans can be in fantasy.
And it sounds like you're doing a story that, like, I think everyone here is doing stories that that they want to see. Like, you're not doing these stories to appeal to some audience because you think that they're going to make you a bunch of money. I mean, if you were, you wouldn't be doing comics, first of all.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I agree, and thank you. Yeah, this is definitely a story from the heart.
Okay, Guillermo, we would love to hear from you, not just about Aztec, but also a little bit about your previous project, Mulaka, which it also has an indigenous element component to it, but is a really different type of story.
Yeah, that's right. Well, first of all, it's going to be very hard to really top all of what we've already seen thus far, because it's truly amazing, marvelous work that honestly really inspire not just myself but the rest of the team, and some of your work we've already seen before, and it's part of the inspiration that led us to do all of what we've done thus far. That said, as you just mentioned, it's going to be hard to talk about Aztec, which is of course the one game that we're working on that's taking inspiration from the Aztec and Nahua and Mexica mythology, without talking first about Mulaka, and even before that, without talking first about some of the ideas that came about when we originally founded the studio. Right, we wanted to create a studio that made video games because we are passionate about video games, but video games that were able to tell stories that went beyond just entertainment. And so we wanted to showcase, we wanted to give the spotlight, we wanted to present the world with some of the things, some of the stories that we thought were special, we thought were unique, we thought were not being showcased enough. And we originally started that with the Tarahumara community, la comunidad Tarahumara, la comunidad Rarámuri of the northern part of Mexico, which is a Native American tribe that to this day is still very much active and still very much exists, right? And they are still living very traditional lives. So we wanted to take that as a starting point for the type of stories that we wanted to showcase. And so we created this entire experience, which is Mulaka, around the myths and legends and characters and places that are important to them. And in order to do that, we aligned heavily with the community, right? We worked in tandem with them. We approached them. We basically gave this opportunity for the community to tell a story that was theirs, with us doing it. And it's kind of like a controversial take, because we're not a part per se of the culture, but we arrive at that situation where if we didn't do it ourselves, then probably no one was ever going to do it. And that was going to be a disservice, because the richness that this mythology has is just on par with any other popular mythology out there. And we couldn't stand hearing about another Norse-inspired game or Greek or Roman-inspired game or samurai or ninja-inspired game and have the world be missing on something as rich as what the Tarahumara mythology was for us. And so we started working on that. We eventually created a game that really was a love letter to that. We gave the game to the community as a vehicle for trying to solve a number of problems. Specifically with the Tarahumara was about language preservation and about reaching a specific audience, which in their case was the youngest generation of the Tarahumara, who are slowly losing touch with that cultural heritage that they have. And video games are, of course, a fantastic way for us to reach that specific audience, right? And so once we were done with that, and that was sometime in early 2018, we wanted to take it a step further and go for do the same for a mythology that it's very, very dear to everyone. The universe of the game basically answers a very simple question, but one that we thought was really, really interesting to think about, which is what would have happened if the one thing that we know is probably the most important event in the history of the Americas didn't happen, right? And that event is, of course, the Spanish and the conquest of the old world into the new world. What would happen if that just never happened, right? For whatever reason, what would happen if the Spaniards, if the English, if the Portuguese, if all of the conquering forces that came from the old world, for whatever reason, just never came, and we in turn allowed the Mesoamerican civilizations to continue growing, to continue evolving, to continue pushing into a future that's way past their time, way past our own time, and way further ahead.
Love it. And that
Almost
is
here.
coming later this year, right? That'll be available for play later this year.
That's correct. Yes, it's going to be available later this year and in fall 2021 on every platform that exists, both Xbox as well PlayStations, PC, and Nintendo Switch.
So Paul, Aztec Empire is your current project, and Chronos is something that you previously created for DC, right?
Yeah, that was actually that's a testament to how long I've been interested in Aztec subjects. So
tell us about Aztec Empire.
Aztec Empire is basically a culmination of 3 childhood interests: 1, Mexico; 2, world history; and 3, science fiction. I've always been fascinated with the idea that this event of 1519 to 1521 is literally an alien first contact story. There's 2 sides of the planet meeting for the first time in 10,000 years. Each side of the planet developed their own thing at their own pace, and it's just a unique story. And as we approach the 500th anniversary, I became quite frustrated by the fact that this has never been told in a visual medium, in any kind of pop culture medium. There's plenty of texts, there's plenty of prose histories, but nothing visual. And also became very upset with the mythology that surrounds this story that was created by Spanish colonial, basically Spanish colonial friars in the 16th century, that made up these things about how Cortez was a returning Quetzalcoatl, and the Aztecs thought the Spaniards were gods, and that's nonsense. Also about how Cortez had this romantic relationship with his teenage slave girl, who also was a translator. I mean, it was all very, very upsetting to me. So I was like, okay, look, let me try and see if I can't adapt the texts, the original texts before the hundreds of years of Spanish propaganda got, messed them up. So basically what this is the 2 primary texts are the Florentine Codex, which is a 12-volume history of the Aztecs. Yes, it was supervised by Spanish friars, but it's as close as we're going to get. And then a memoir from one of the foot soldiers in Cortez's expedition, who didn't have any problems, saying things that from our perspective would be amazingly critical and basically narc out his expedition, the way they behaved and such. So, it's sort of like the difference between reading about Columbus and then reading his diaries. There's a huge, huge difference. So I thought that just a straightforward adaptation of texts was something that needed to happen. So before I even started to execute pages, I did the outreach. I spent a year just trying to develop relationships with the Mexican academics, activists, artists, and to a place where I felt confident enough, and started putting out the material in real time, so that I could get real-time feedback, so that if I got something wrong, I could change it. And in fact, actually lately I've been spending too much time making tiny little corrections instead of producing new pages, which I'll be getting to this fall. There's going to be new stuff coming.
So Aztec Empire is intended to be an historical account of the Spanish Aztec conflict, and I think you're doing yourself a disservice by saying you're adapting these materials, because there's a lot more to it than that. But tell us what we're looking at right here. This is, where are you opening your story?
So we start out in Tenochtitlan because this is going to be the centerpiece of the entire story. I wanted to start here. So Messenger runs up and he's looking, and this is just an excuse for us to show off a peek of Tenochtitlan. I want to do this all in slow reveals. We have yet to show the full city in its glory. So the messenger is bringing this information to Aztec generals, and he comes up to them and he gives them information about how these strangers are looking for one of their own kind. There was a Spanish castaway who will join the expedition and become their translator, at least while they're dealing with the Maya. Then after they defeat the Maya in a couple battles, they wind up getting a tribute of gold and textiles and 20 slave girls. And one of them winds up becoming Cortez's translator. So in the next page, in the next slide, you can see some of the process that I go through in just producing a single panel. So I have to deal with the structures and then the murals on the structures. and then people's clothing, patterns in their clothing. So it's there's a lot of moving parts.
And now we're all back. In the course of working on these projects and others that you may have worked on that had influences from Mesoamerican cultures, did you learn anything that surprised you? What did you learn anything that surprised you or that was different from what you thought going in? And Henry, I think you touched on this a little bit. Can you speak to that?
Sure.
First?
I was lucky to like start this, because of the Paul's Patreon. I had a place to start, and I was very interested in the indigenous part, and I didn't know that they had omens that were sent to them, that they believe were sent to them, and what confirmed me wanting to do the story was Moctezuma sending magicians down to stop the Spanish. And please, anybody correct me if I'm wrong, but like what a horrible time to find out magic is not real when these like white-skinned bearded men are putting swords into your stomach and you're like trying to do hocus pocus. And I was like, oh, okay, so like they did believe in magic, and there is fantasy here. I'm not doing something that's too stupid, because I think I'm stupid, as I didn't go to college. I'm just making comics, and I think I'm doing something that's like worth talking about. So that was an interesting thing to find out.
I don't think it's silly, actually, that they thought, magic was real. I mean, it's like if we were being invaded by aliens and we were like, well, God will protect us, for
Right.
Christianity. And we were like praying to God and like, no. And like some people believe that we're the center of the universe and that God only created humanity and that's it. But then when they're confronted with a different reality, I can see how devastating that must be, and like also a huge blow to the morale of people. So I can see how that must have affected them severely. It's like suddenly not being in favor or like being favored by their own territory. They're in their own turf. So I don't think that's silly. I think that's a really good point to address.
Thank you. I don't mean silly. Yeah, it is. I think magic is silly. I just think it's like interesting. But yeah, thank you.
Just going with you in there, they had this very interesting, clash of, of course, there's things that we don't understand that require a special or specific kind of like study to understand them. Or to replicate them or to do whatever. But at the same time, and that's what, part of what really marveled me is they also have this other school of technical and perhaps more landed scientifical ground-based knowledge that we don't always give them enough credit for, right? And this, of course, started with not just the Aztec, but the entirety of Mesoamerica, but their knowledge in mathematics and science and astrology and even in social structuring and urban planning and architecture. Like there's a lot of groundbreaking discoveries that started with Mesoamerican communities and Mesoamerican civilizations that, really do, you realize once you understand them that they were so much more than just a bunch of Indians, right? As maybe the Spaniards want us to, by their books and by their recallings of things, want us to believe, right? So much more than that. And there's still so much more to discover and to understand about them and their ways of thinking. That's it's always exciting, right? Every year there's something new that's like, oh my God, these guys knew about that too. So that's what I love about them.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I mean, I like that two-pronged way of thinking about it, like their scientific and architectural and engineering prowess and their understanding of like magic and esoterica and metaphysics. And both of those things are, bring surprises to me all the time. And one of the things that I think that Mexican and Mexican American creators who play in this creative space are often shocked to discover is that so many of our traditions that we don't even think about as being rooted in indigeneity are. And so from, the school of magicians that we're talking about, the Nahualtin, who have now like kind of devolved into our modern Nahuales, to to like what I was talking about before, lechuzas, who were the
Dia de Muertos.
the Los Muertos, which used to be 2 entire months of celebrations of the beloved departed, that have now been kind of reduced to a 2 or 3 day celebration. Just so many of our stories. I mean, even things like as things like La Llorona, there were multiplicities of Lloronas, of Soaecatl, in Nahuatl tradition among the Nahuas. And so, like, the more you dig, the more you begin to recognize roots there as well. And I'm especially speaking for the Mexican and Mexican American creators on the panel, because like most of us, I would say that all 4 of us on the panel who are of Mexican extraction, our families were de-indigenized, and we, some of us have discovered those connections a little bit more. Henry, like, speaking like this really beautifully about what that feels like, and Guillermo, I know that you've worked with a Purepecha, and that's going to be awesome. But sometimes like our roots may not be discoverable, and so at least digging into this, we find like this common Mexican heritage that we were chatting about before we started recording. That's kind of like the like the cultural patrimony of the Mexican American people. Some of these pre-Columbian elements that still exist in our lives, and the stories that our abuelas tell us, or whatever. It's interesting just to find, when you find that connection, like everything else starts to fall in place, and you feel almost as if you're being moved to do the work that you're doing. Because
Absolutely. And it's
you
like,
go ahead.
For at least for me, it was my grandfather. I mean, because my brothers and I, my dad's dad, he is from Laredo, Texas. He is the American one in the family, but my mom's parents, they're all indigenous. My grandmother, my dad's mom has indigenous blood in her, and it's like she's more mestizo than my mom's parents. Like, they're indigenous, and it's like coming, like, being perceived as white because we are white passing. I have green eyes. It's like, how much more white passing can you get? It's my grandfather always like drilled it in our heads, like, hey, you might look that way, but you're Mexican, and so remember that. And this is like, we were living in Cancun, and when I'm little, I don't think about those things. It's like, well, yeah, duh, what, like, so what? So he would try to drill in our heads, like, hey, be proud of this. This is your cultural heritage. So when you're young, it doesn't really click. For me, it took me a while, because it is until I moved to the US when I was 17 that I am. And I felt so out of place coming into this country. I felt like I had to reconnect. And that's how Onyx began. It was really thanking my grandfather for all of his teachings, for taking us to like all the museums, to like the archaeological sites, and truly like just planting that seed of love for Mexico. So yeah, like you're right. Like, you discover these things. I didn't actually consider it discovering, but I think it is discovering that you want to take part of that, whether it's because you found out or because you want to reconnect, and you want to, more than anything, share the beauty of Mesoamerican Mexico.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and anybody outside of Aztec, any knowledge of Aztec culture, all they have to do is just think about how all cultures have a spectrum of, secular to religious, of real to surreal. I mean, and one of the things, as I write this, because I have to do parallels between these, these medieval Catholics and these Aztecs, and both cultures had their own versions of what we would call atheists or fanatics. So it's as soon as you start to realize that any sophisticated culture, and Aztecs certainly were, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of beliefs. There's a spectrum of opinion. I mean, like even in the story, like there was an entire contingent that were convinced that the Spanish were just marauders, and it was a huge mistake to do anything but wipe them out. And then there was another that was like, oh no, these are ambassadors from another country, and we have to go through all of our diplomatic protocols, which includes treating them well and giving them presents and stuff like that. And where there's witches, like in the Aztecs, and there's also there was also a guy on the Spanish expedition who was sort of like the Spanish version of like a witch doctor, or like a sort of astrologist kind of character. And then one of Cortez's key lieutenants, Sandoval, was a straight up atheist. He didn't believe in God, and he would make fun of his fellow Spaniards. So as soon as you realize that there's a spectrum to every culture, and as soon as you open your eyes to that, then it all starts to like, oh, okay, starts to click, light bulbs start to go off.
Starts feeling more relatable to you. I mean, because as you mentioned, right, it's once you realize this was an actual civilization with a plethora of roles and peoples and ideologies and whatnot. Even going back to the Aztecs, their mythology, like their theology was at the end of the day, and I know that I'm oversimplifying it, but it's a continuation of other traditions and other ways of thinking and other lines of thought that go all the way back to Olmecs and even beforehand, right? And we eventually started finding differences in how Huitzilopochtli, it's an Aztec only deity that but Quetzalcoatl has been around for the longest time, and it's gone by all sorts of names, and it's like just like and this is also not a great take maybe, but Catholic, Roman Catholics, and all the plethora of different Catholic or Christian ways of thinking are, again, variety within that same line of thinking, just as ancient civilizations and even going back beyond. So it's once you see that and you realize that we've been doing the same thing since back in the Stone Age all the way to today, in the way that we use storytelling for any given purpose. You realize that these were real people, and you start empathizing with them a little bit more easily.
Yeah. In closing, I just want to ask everyone if you have any recommendations for our audience on resources that they can use to learn more about Mesoamerican cultures and history, and/or new creative projects from other people that you are excited about and want to recommend. Henry, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. Paul, everyone go to Paul's Patreon. But also your library. I was able to get all the books Paul put on his reading list through my local library. A very, very old Cortez War Journal that's out of print. It was tethered. I was able to get through Los Angeles Public Library. I'm very fortunate that the LA Public Library has a lot of books that is on his list. The Broken Spears. Also, there are a lot of indigenous and Latinx bookstores around the country. There's one in LA. There's one in Tucson, Arizona. Try to support those folks that have Nahuatl like language books is what there's a lot of resources that way. Libraries, bookstores, and Paul's Patreon.
Well, I guess I'll just follow up on that. Yeah, there's a couple of books for what I'm working on. The Spanish invasion, the 1921 window. There's this great book by David Caraballo called Collision of Worlds. And then there, for large overview from going from the mythical foundings up to the colonial period, there's a book called The Fifth Sun by Camilla Townsend. And then I would recommend a couple of webcomics, since I'm doing a webcomic. There's a webcomic called Two Heroes and a webcomic called Codex Black. So I'd ask, go check those out.
I was literally about to shout out the same two. So
Yeah.
David, any resource or entertainment recommendations?
Yeah, no, Paul's named the resources that I would probably mention. But I would suggest anybody who likes space opera, you should definitely check out the Teixcalan series by Arcady Martin. She's from New Mexico, and she's done this really, really fantastic job of creating like a kind of like Dune-like space opera series that has a like an Aztec type empire at its heart, and it's super well done, really beautiful, very poetic, just all out badass. So check that out if you haven't already.
I do have a couple recommendations, but these are maybe a little bit more tailored, and maybe that's because it was easier for me to find them here. For our Spanish-speaking audience, for our Mexican-based audience, there's this little book that's all about more of the mythological side, which is called. It's not the best in terms of accuracy, but it's good for an introduction, which is called Breve Historia de los Aztecas, or a brief history of the Aztecs. That's very good. Another one that I really used a lot, specifically because our game is about deities, is Enigmas de los Dioses del México Antiguo, or the mysteries of the gods in ancient Mexico, which is a really good book, also for use as a reference, that you can find pretty much anywhere in Mexico, or even on Amazon, so should be easy to find. As things for recommend for you guys to check out, I would suggest everyone in this panel, any content from anyone in here, it's fantastic, and you should really check it out.
All right, Sophia, did you have anything to add? I know that Paul stole your recommendations.
Oh yeah, stolen. Well, there is this game called Mictlan that I just found, and I'm super excited for it. It's still in development, but they have an Instagram, I believe. I'm not sure if they have a Twitter, but if you guys just Google, thank you.
Yeah, you can find it.
Okay, yeah, so it's called Mictlan the game, and it looks badass. It's more realistic when it comes to the art style. It kind of almost reminds me of like World of Warcraft, like that kind of like immersiveness to the world. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about that.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for the recommendations and for sharing your work. We are hoping to do a live stream Q&A and discussion after this. So check the panel description and check our Twitter feeds for information about that. And hopefully that will give people a chance to interact with us more directly. And I just want to say thank you again. I'm a big admirer of all of your work, and we really appreciate you being here today. And thank you to our audience for joining us at Comic-Con at Home.